December 12, 1944. The air was brittle with winter across the American Midwest, the kind of morning when breath turned instantly into a white veil. A train screeched against icy rails as it pulled into a station near a small manufacturing town in Iowa. Its cargo was not coal, not grain, but human beings, hundreds of captured German soldiers. Their uniforms stripped of insignia, their spirits dulled by defeat. They shuffled down from the cars under the watchful eyes of armed guards, expecting barbed wire, concrete barracks, and perhaps a sense of humiliation that would press down heavier than the cold itself. Yet what greeted them first was not the sight of their captors' guns, but something stranger, almost incomprehensible. Women in work clothes, welding helmets under their arms, boots dusted with soot, walking confidently out of a nearby factory. Sparks and smoke spilled from the open doors of the plant, and the women laughed unapologetically, loudly, as though the war did not weigh on their shoulders at all. For these prisoners of war, schooled in Nazi ideology since their youth, this was not simply surprising. It was disorienting, as though the world had tilted. In Germany, women were bound to the doctrine of Kinder, Küche, Kirche, meaning children, kitchen, and church. Goebbels himself had thundered that the mission of women is to be beautiful and to bring children into the world. That was what they had been told, again and again, in schools, in parades, in propaganda reels. Yet here, on a random morning in the heartland of their enemy, women were stepping into roles the Third Reich had declared biologically impossible for them. One POW would later write in his diary, smuggled back after the war, "We were told American women were frivolous, weak, but the first ones I saw were blackened with smoke, their hands steady with steel. They looked stronger than us." The guards herded the men toward trucks, engines rattling, but the prisoners' eyes kept drifting back toward the factory. It was not just the image of women working with men that shocked them, it was the casual normality of it. No one stared, no one whispered. American men in overalls walked beside their female counterparts, handing over tools, wiping grease from their hands, speaking as equals. To the POWs, raised under a hierarchy that placed women firmly below, the scene was almost unthinkable. One young soldier, barely 19, muttered to his comrade in disbelief, "If we had done this in Germany, the Führer would have collapsed." The words earned a smirk. But beneath the jest was an unease that settled heavily in their chests. Inside the camp, the astonishment lingered, some on nearby farms, some cutting timber, others painting fences or repairing roads. Yet wherever they went, the sight repeated itself. Women in factories, women driving trucks, women in uniform for the Women's Army Corps. Each glimpse chipped away at assumptions drilled into them since adolescence. It was not just that women were working. It was that they were competent, commanding, unapologetic. One POW recalled being stunned by a female truck driver who maneuvered a massive vehicle through mud with a cigarette in her mouth, honking cheerfully at the line of men staring from behind barbed wire. In Germany, he later reflected, she would have been locked away. Here she was the driver of the future. This clash between expectation and reality did more than amuse. It unsettled. Nazi propaganda had insisted America was weak, fractured, soft. But here was evidence to the contrary. America's strength did not just come from the millions of men in uniform. It came from the women welding ships, riveting planes, and keeping the engines of war alive at home. Cold statistics supported the vision before their eyes. By 1944, nearly 6 million American women had joined the workforce, filling 1/3 of all industrial jobs. Posters of Rosie the Riveter adorned factory walls, but to the POWs, the slogans were unnecessary. The reality was already louder than any words. The townspeople themselves treated it as commonplace. At the local diner, waitresses wore aprons only until their shifts ended. Then some traded them for uniforms at the shell-packing plant. Mothers carried lunch pails, teenagers pedaled bicycles toward assembly lines, grandmothers worked as inspectors. The POWs whispered among themselves, trying to process this world where femininity and labor coexisted so easily. Some resisted the idea, clinging to their indoctrination. "It is a trick," one insisted. After the war, they will go back to the kitchen. Yet the longer they stayed, the harder that claim was to sustain. The emotional shock was sharper for those who had left wives or fiancés in Germany. They remembered women who queued endlessly for rations, who shivered in bomb shelters, who were told their only duty was to bear children for the Reich. To see American women welding steel beams while laughing with men their age was not only jarring, it stung with envy. In the letters that somehow escaped censorship, fragments of these revelations confessed to his brother. They placed them in the open, where the work is hardest, and the women seemed glad to be there. There was irony, too, for the Americans watching them. Guards often chuckled at the way POWs gawked at passing female workers, as though they had seen a ghost. One veteran later quipped, "The Germans thought our women would be baking pies. They didn't expect them to be making bombers." It became a kind of private joke. The mighty Wehrmacht reduced to wide-eyed disbelief at the sight of a woman with a wrench. But beneath the humor was something heavier, more enduring. For some POWs, these images gnawed at the certainties of their world. If the Reich had lied about women, what else had it lied about? If America's supposed decadence produced such vigor, what did that say about the war itself? Not all prisoners asked these questions aloud, but the thoughts lingered like embers. A single glance at a woman in a welding mask could set aflame doubts more dangerous to Nazi ideology than any American rifle. As night fell on their first day in the camp, the prisoners huddled in wooden barracks. Steam rising from thin soup bowls, the wind rattling loose shutters. The day's images replayed in their minds, the laughter outside the factory, the sparks of steel, the calm authority of women at work. One young man whispered into the dark, almost as if confessing a crime, "Maybe they are stronger than we thought." His words faded quickly, drowned by snores and shifting blankets. But the idea had already been planted. What none of them could know was that this was only the beginning. For every day that passed, every work detail and every passing glance at America's women in industry, the shock would deepen. And in time, it would change them. Not all, not immediately, but enough to matter. The world they had been promised was crumbling, and what they would witness next would shake even the most faithful among them. The prisoners soon discovered that the strange sight of women in factories was not an accident of geography or a single town's quirk. It was the defining rhythm of America in wartime. What they had glimpsed that first December morning repeated itself in city after city, farm after farm, until disbelief turned into a constant hum of astonishment. To understand their shock, one must recall the world they had come from. In Nazi Germany, gender roles were not merely customs. They were commandments. From the first day of school, young boys were told their destiny was to fight, and young girls were told their purpose was to bear children for the Reich. Women were elevated in propaganda only as mothers, honored with the Cross of Honor of the German. Their place in factories was temporary, tolerated only in desperation, and even then cloaked in shame. One prisoner later remembered how his fiancée had wept when she was ordered into a munitions plant in Germany in 1943, ashamed of leaving the kitchen and nursery. She was paid less than men, scorned if she showed competence, and constantly reminded that her work was borrowed from her true duty as wife and mother. When these same men saw American women not hiding their labor but celebrated for it, their sense of order cracked. In the Reich, posters showed blonde mothers gazing at cradles. In America, posters showed women flexing arms, sleeves rolled with the slogan, "We can do it." It was as though two civilizations had written opposite scripts for half their population. The numbers made the contrast impossible to ignore. By 1944, more than 6 million American women had entered the workforce. 35% of the civilian labor force wore trousers or coveralls, many for the first time. In aircraft plants from Seattle to Long Beach, women built bombers and fighters with precision. At Ford's River Rouge plant in Detroit, women ran stamping presses that shook the earth, while at Bethlehem Steel in Pennsylvania, they stood beside roaring furnaces. The Germans behind barbed wire heard the statistics from newspapers aloud into the camps, but the raw data was less unsettling than the casual ease with which Americans accepted it. No one seemed embarrassed. No one whispered that these women were unnatural. Instead, they were depicted on newsreels as heroes. The emotional impact on the POWs was amplified by the small moments, the human glimpses. A group marched past a hangar and saw a young woman, no older than 20, balancing on scaffolding as she riveted the wing of a bomber. She whistled while she worked, a tune from the radio, her hair tucked under a scarf patterned with stars. She didn't notice the prisoners staring at her, but the guards did, and smirked at the Germans' wide eyes. Another time, a convoy of trucks passed the camp, driven entirely by women in uniform, their caps angled smartly, cigarettes dangling from fingers as they waved at townsfolk. One prisoner muttered under his breath, "If this is weakness, then we were lied to." The contrast was so stark, it became a kind of cultural whiplash. Nazi leaders had told them America was decadent, that democracy reduced men to weakness and women to frivolity. Yet here, frivolity looked a lot like strength. In their letters, POWs sometimes attempted to reconcile the contradiction. Perhaps, one speculated, they allow women to work because they have no choice, but it gives them a strange energy. Others simply mocked the idea out of fear. "It cannot last," they insisted. "After the war, the women will go back to the kitchen." But with every passing week, those words sounded hollower. For the Americans, the arrangement felt obvious. When millions of men were drafted, the nation needed labor. But more than necessity, there was pride. A woman could walk into a diner covered in grease from a 12, even admiration. To the POWs, this was revolutionary. In Germany, women who showed strength were derided. In America, they were photographed for magazines. Life magazine published images of women straddling factory machines, grinning confidently, and those magazines sometimes made their way into the camps. Germans who had been raised on endless parades of swastikas now turned pages to find American women, hair pinned back, gripping welding torches with a gleam in their eyes. The human mind often clings to the familiar, but some POWs could not keep their thoughts from wandering. If their government had lied about women, what else had it lied about? If Americans were supposedly decadent but managed to harness this much power, how weak was decadence, truly? The questions were dangerous, but war has a way of cracking certainties. One young soldier later admitted, decades after returning to Germany, that the sight of women working with men had been the first time he suspected the Reich might not last. It was a small thought, he confessed, but it grew each day. Of course, disbelief sometimes spilled into humor. Guards recalled POWs shaking their heads in exaggerated amazement. One quipped, "Back home, if a woman picked up a wrench, we'd call it a scandal. Here they call it Tuesday." The Americans laughed. But beneath the irony lay a confession. Their worldview was under siege, not by bombs or bullets, but by the quiet hum of factories staffed by women. Even the rhythms of daily life reinforced the divide. At roll call, the Germans were ordered to march out, only to see women pedaling bicycles toward shifts, skirts flapping, toolboxes strapped to their backs. At dusk, they watched silhouettes through factory windows, sparks flying like fireflies as women bent over machines. It was not one grand spectacle that shook them. It was the accumulation of 1,000 small images, each defying the expectations they carried across the Atlantic. And always, there was the laughter. It unnerved them, that sound. German women they knew back home rarely laughed in public, especially under the strain of bombing raids and ration cards. But here, in wartime America, laughter seemed to echo out of workshops and truck cabs. One POW remarked bitterly, "They laugh while they build the machines that will kill us." Yet even in his bitterness was recognition. These women were not powerless. They were shaping the war as surely as the soldiers on the front lines. By the spring of 1945, the contrast had seeped into every corner of their perception. America's women were not a sideshow. They were part of the main act. The Reich had promised a vision of eternal order, but the evidence before their eyes suggested that societies could thrive when women worked shoulder to shoulder with men. It was an idea so alien, so dissonant, that some POWs simply shut their minds to it. But others carried it silently, like a forbidden treasure, and though the war would soon end, the questions planted in those winter months would not. For many, the memories of women with sparks in their hair and steel under their hands would travel back across the ocean with them, reshaping how they saw their own country in the years to come. They did not yet know it, but the very sight that unsettled them in America would follow them into the ruins of post-war Germany. And what they would face there would make these memories impossible to forget. Behind the fences, life settled into routines that disguised their strangeness. The barbed wire cast long shadows across snow-dusted fields, and wooden barracks smelled of damp wool and thin soup. German prisoners of war woke each morning to whistles, lined up in ragged columns, and were marched toward their assigned labor. Yet while the work occupied their hands, their minds often drifted back to the images that had unsettled them most. Those women outside the wire, driving, welding, riveting, seemed to press into their thoughts more insistently than the guards' rifles. It was here, with their shock more openly. In letters, smuggled or censored, fragments of disbelief appeared. One young soldier wrote to his sister, "They treat their women as comrades, not as porcelain." Another scribbled lines that were later preserved in an archive. "Everywhere one sees women with tools, uniforms, independence. It unsettles me more than defeat in battle." The War Department read such words carefully, striking out sections before delivery, but some testimony slipped through. These letters became whispered currency within the barracks, read aloud by candlelight when guards were absent, each phrase carrying more weight than official speeches had ever done. Guards, too, remembered the astonishment. An Iowa farmer recalled years later that the POWs assigned to his land would stop their work when a neighbor's daughter arrived with a tractor. She was only 17, hair tied back in a red scarf, and she handled the machine with the authority of any hired hand. "The Germans stared like statues," he chuckled. "One of them finally said to me, 'In Germany, this would be shameful.' I told him, 'Here, it's just work.' He didn't answer." These moments, so ordinary to Americans, struck the prisoners as revelations, as if every passing encounter confirmed the collapse of the lessons drilled into them since childhood. Among the POWs themselves, the reactions varied. Some mocked what they saw, dismissing it as temporary chaos forced by wartime. "Once the men return, the women will vanish from the factories," one insisted, puffing his chest as though to reassure himself. Others were quietly impressed, even moved. "They are proud," murmured another, recalling the laughter of women walking home with soot on their cheeks. Still others turned the sight into whispered humor, making jokes in the barracks. "Careful," a prisoner once teased. "An American woman with a hammer might be stronger than you." The laughter that followed was uneasy, masking admiration behind irony. It was not only labor that astonished them, it was authority. In some camps, Red Cross volunteers were women, supervising canteens or organizing recreation. To German eyes, the very idea of a woman issuing instructions to men was disorienting. One POW admitted later, "We could not look her in the eye at first. It felt like betrayal of all we had been told. But she spoke kindly, firmly, as though there was nothing strange." That quiet authority, so natural in America, was more disruptive than any propaganda leaflet. Occasionally, prisoners caught glimpses beyond the factories. They saw women leading civil defense drills, managing ration offices, even organizing church gatherings where decisions were made with men and women seated side by side. These sights blurred the borders between wartime necessity and cultural identity. Could it really be true that a nation so derided as decadent was thriving on cooperation between sexes? The prisoners debated long into the night, their voices hushed under the creak of wooden rafters. Some clung to their upbringing. "It is against nature," they muttered. Others fell silent, their eyes fixed on memories they could not shake. One of the youngest prisoners, barely 19, spoke little for weeks. He had grown up in the Hitler Youth, every lesson saturated with ideology. Yet after watching a line of women emerge from a shell-packing plant, their faces weary but proud, he confessed to a bunkmate, "I thought we were the strong ones. But perhaps strength is not what we were told." That remark circulated quickly, like contraband. No one admitted to repeating it, but many thought about it, turning it over silently as they lay on straw mattresses, in a camp longer than a speech. The irony was not lost on the Americans guarding them. One officer later recalled, "They were hardest to control when women walked by." It wasn't lust, it was disbelief. They looked as though the earth had tilted under them. At times, guards used the shock as quiet amusement, nudging each other when the prisoners froze at the sight of a woman driving a truck. Yet the laughter masked something more serious. These were men confronting a collapse of world view. And though it came without violence, it carried weight. For the women themselves, the gaze of the prisoners was often unnoticed. They had no time to dwell on who watched them from behind fences. Their work was grueling, hours long, their backs sore, their hands blistered. But to the Germans who observed them, these women were living evidence that America's strength was not an illusion. It was forged daily in sweat and steel, carried not only by soldiers on distant fronts, but by women who had claimed space in a nation's machinery. What made the testimony powerful was not only its content, but its persistence. Years later, in memoirs and interviews, former POWs returned again and again to the shock of seeing American women at work. One admitted he could not describe it without embarrassment. It seems small now, but at that moment, it felt like a collapse of truth. Another remembered, with a faint smile, how he had joked that Hitler would faint if he saw a woman driving a tractor. Humor had softened the blow, but the impression had lasted a lifetime. It is difficult to measure ideological cracks in numbers, but the voices from inside the fence reveal them in texture and tone. Men who had marched under banners of certainty now whispered questions in the dark. They did not become Democrats overnight, nor feminists in secret, but they could no longer deny the evidence before their eyes. The Reich had promised eternal order, yet here in America, disorder looked strangely like strength. As winter turned to spring, the snow melting into muddy fields, the prisoners continued their routines. But the laughter of women at work haunted them, not as a memory, but as a constant presence. Some found it comforting, others unbearable. And though most would eventually be shipped back across the Atlantic, carrying with them the weight of defeat, it was these moments, these voices from inside the fence, that endured. They had been taught one world. Now they had glimpsed another, and what they would carry back to Germany in silence or in confession would prove more subversive than they could imagine. For when the war ended, and they returned to homes reduced, to rubble, the memory of those American women would rise again, demanding to be reckoned with. When the war ended, the fences opened. One by one, German prisoners boarded ships that would carry them back across the Atlantic, away from the barracks and barbed wire, back to towns that lay in ruins. They left behind the fields of Iowa, the factories of Michigan, the Red Cross canteens, and the laughter of women in coveralls. But though their boots stepped again on German soil, their minds carried something invisible, fragments of a world that had unsettled and reshaped them. The images clung stubbornly, a woman with sparks in her hair from welding, another gripping. The rivets clanged like gunfire. These memories became seeds, small and quiet, buried deep in men who had once marched under banners of certainty. For many, the shock was sharpened by the contrast of homecoming. They arrived in villages where women had been reduced to shadows. Bombed-out homes stood roofless, children begged for bread, and mothers scavenged through rubble. The Reich had promised honor for their sacrifice, but it had delivered ash. In that devastation, the memory of America's women burned brighter. Where German women had been told their role was to endure in silence, American women had been invited to shape the war itself. The POWs who had seen both worlds struggled to reconcile them. Some spoke cautiously in their families, describing what they had witnessed. Others locked the memories away, ashamed of carrying admiration for the enemy. But the seeds were there, and over years they would sprout. Historians later uncovered testimonies that traced the change. A former prisoner recalled, decades after, 1945, how he could not forget the image of women operating lathes in Detroit. "It was the first time," he admitted, "that I thought the Nazis had lied to us about everything." Another described standing in his ruined hometown, staring at his wife who had carried water from a well all day, and remembering with painful clarity the American woman who had driven a truck past the camp fence. He could not say it aloud, but the comparison haunted him. Democracy, which he had been taught to despise, seemed to hold a strength Germany had denied itself. The Americans had not intended to remake their captives' ideas of gender. The camps were designed for containment, not enlightenment. Yet the daily exposure to American life had been more persuasive than any lecture. No guard needed to explain equality when the evidence walked past in boots and denim. No propaganda was necessary when laughter rang out from a welding floor. The prisoners, stripped of weapons and pride, had no choice but to see. And seeing was enough. Some POWs carried these impressions into their post-war lives, shaping the way they viewed women in their own families. Oral histories record men encouraging daughters to pursue education or quietly supporting wives who sought work. These were small acts, often unnoticed, but they marked subtle departures from the rigid dogma of the past. Others became more vocal. One former prisoner interviewed in the 1980s confessed that his admiration for American women had been the seed of his lifelong support for gender equality in West Germany. "It began," he said, "with disbelief. It ended with conviction." Of course, not every man changed. Many clung to tradition, dismissing what they had seen as an aberration of wartime necessity. Yet even their silence betrayed something. They could not erase the memory, even if they denied its meaning. The world they had glimpsed remained lodged inside them, a reminder that their upbringing had not told the whole truth. For some, that realization widened into a broader reckoning. If the Reich had misled them about women, had it also lied about Jews, about democracy, about freedom itself? In this way, the sight of women in overalls became more than a curiosity. It became a crack in the foundation of ideology. The irony was sharp. The Nazis had sought to prove their superiority on battlefields, but America had demonstrated its strength in shipyards and factories through women who wielded tools as confidently as rifles. For the POWs, this was not an abstract theory. It was a lived reality, witnessed day after day until disbelief turned into reluctant respect. And when they returned home, that in the folds of memory. The story does not end in 1945. As West Germany rebuilt, women pushed gradually into roles once denied them. They entered universities, joined professions, and demanded voices in politics. Change was slow, uneven, often resisted. Yet among those shaping the new Germany were men who had once been prisoners in America, who had seen another possibility with their own eyes. One testified that he had voted for policies supporting women's work because I remembered Rosie the Riveter. Another said he encouraged his daughter to study medicine because he could not forget the competence he had witnessed. History is never made by a single moment, but by countless impressions carried quietly in hearts. Even decades later, in reunions of former POWs, the subject returned. Laughter would ripple through the group as someone recalled their shock at seeing a woman drive a tractor. But the laughter was tinged with humility. They knew that in those small moments, something had shifted. What had once seemed laughable had become undeniable. And in their old age, they admitted it more freely. America's women had shown them strength in a form their own nation had refused to recognize. The legacy of those impressions is difficult to measure, but it lingers in testimony, in diaries, in subtle changes across generations. A German soldier who once scoffed at the sight of a woman in work clothes might later tell his granddaughter to follow her ambition. A prisoner who once muttered that women belonged in kitchens might, years later, stand quietly proud as his daughter became a lawyer or teacher. These were not revolutions shouted in the streets. They were transformations whispered in kitchens and classrooms, shaped by memories carried home from a war they had lost. And so the story of German POWs in America is not only one of captivity, it is also one of confrontation, with ideology, with culture, with themselves. They came as soldiers, defeated and confined, expecting humiliation. Instead, they encountered something stranger and perhaps more powerful, a society that entrusted women with steel, fire, and responsibility. For some, this was more destabilizing than defeat on the battlefield. For others, it was the beginning of a new understanding of strength. The war had ended, but its lessons traveled silently with the men who returned. And among those lessons, none was more subversive than the memory of women working alongside men, their laughter ringing above the hum of machines. It was proof that the Reich had lied, proof that democracy held unexpected vigor, proof that strength could be shared. And in the silence of post-war Germany, as the nation searched for a new identity, these memories resurfaced, sparks from a world once glimpsed through the wire. They had arrived home, but the America they carried within them was not so easily left behind. And what that memory would ignite, in families, in generations, was still unfolding.